Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you happen stance into this truth bomb conversation with my friend from the Great White North, a gentleman that I just happenstance to have interacted with on social media, particularly on X, formerly known as Twitter. And the gentleman I'm speaking to is a guy by the name of Reagan Boychuk, and he comes from Alberta, Canada. And that, for those of you who are paying attention to tariffs and let's just say our friends from the North booing the Star Spangled Banner, and I would say appropriately, in NHL hockey games as well as the NBA Toronto Raptors game, and all that goes with it. Reagan has been feeding me information for some time about some tremendous information that corroborates and correlates to a lot of the information that I've been providing to everybody out there that I've been trying to get this message to in context specifically of the great coup d'etat that is underway, but that has been underway for literally decades. And I think this is the final death knell into the American democracy that the billionaire project that Reagan is going to help illuminate by way of the Rockefeller enterprises. But where I start with all things now, quite frankly, is the latest incarnation, which I put back to the Koch brothers and all of their verticals that launched from the beginning of you know, this sort of libertarian revolution of the 80s, if you will, that then is manifested into the American Tea Party that's definitely co-opted with MAGA, that gave opportunity because the billionaire sort of emergence, as well as the backdoor of the stuff we've seen in our Supreme Court, and I could go on and on and on. But I mean, it's a five-alarm fire. You know, Reagan, we saw in our country on Friday something that's never happened in the history of the United States. There was a great purge at the FBI. So the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the top law enforcement agency in the United States, is now effectively a private police force for a president that led an insurrection that the Supreme Court of the United States etch-a-sketched the 14th Amendment, Section 3, in the Civil War and all the battles that we fought to create this absolute monstrosity. But now I'm going to turn it over to you, Reagan, because in our ongoing email interaction and dialogue, you continue to deliver gobsmacking information that seems to be, I don't even know when I put the beginning of the Rockefeller sort of paradigm, but it has to be, I don't know, let's just call it, I'm going to let you take us through it. But the bottom line is, let's start with the now, because we just saw the tariffs happen. We just saw, I think there was a threat that I believe Trump put on hold this morning, even though global markets are tanking, in which I think we're seeing a tariff of 20% on Canadian goods across the board, whiskey, that sort of thing, timber. But I think it was 10% for oil coming out of the tar sands region. So maybe you can start with sort of an entry point and then give us a broader contextualization of what America needs to hear from our friends in the North.
Okay, yeah. Today, these tariffs, this is an act of war. Trump is threatening real war in third world countries. And for allies in the West, it's economic war. It's something like the Christian Crusades were actually against other Christians.
Right.
And this world war is against our friends. And starting with Canada and Alberta, after decades of free trade, NAFTA, even Trump renegotiated it himself with the current prime minister not long ago. But all of a sudden, that ended. Full stop. No more talk of free trade. Whoever heard of that? We're back to a century ago tariffs. Incredibly regressive taxes on foreigners uh, instead of progressive income taxes on your local oligarchy. And today's events are hard for people to make sense of, but when they're placed in the historical context of the US Canadian relationship and fading American hegemony, their international power, it starts to make a lot more sense that the world is repolarizing into the American sphere and everyone else, and America's tightening their grip on Germany, Canada, etc., etc. And that's what Canadians here are struggling to come to terms with. We don't appreciate how close the American grip is, this how serious these tariffs are. And underlying all of it is the fact that Canada is actually a formal American empire and was adopted in 1940 under the Ogdensburg Treaty. And that's how Canada has proceeded in the 75 years since, as a possession of the Rockefellers and then the US state as they were after World War II were integrated. And what we saw since then under the Koch brothers is the privatization of that imperial endeavor, which started out under Standard Oil around the world before there was a CIA or that sort of aggressive American foreign policy. There was the oil industry,
True,
and
true. But
can
before you move forward, let me just kind of hit a pause and ask you this in terms of the contextualization of the caveat that you know that there's many of us in the United States that are allies with you. That we understand what you're saying is on paper. When you said that regarding the geopolitics and the actual, I'm trying to think of the corporatist term of basically like a blob taking over the sort of verticals of both the economic and the trade as well as all of the aspects of what would I think Canada is our number one exporter of well we import a majority of our oil from Canada, correct? And so if we were to consider what the American sphere is doing that might take us back 100 years, I would add the caveat that this is also a globalist white supremacist Putin fossil fuel financial juggernaut that is enveloping all, and I know there's those in Canada that are on that side as well, for example, right? So it's this sort of breakup of the post World War II global paradigm that we're now going into maybe was this nightmare but dream of the America First white supremacists who were already in bed with the Nazis at that time, and all that correlates, right? But maybe you can give me, as we move into this Rockefeller sort of situation, if there is a difference as you roll this out, quite frankly, between let's just say the corporatists that have had their fingers in the Alberta pie for, going back to I think you just said about the 30s, but how that might be more icing on the cake for a guy whose entire genesis at the moment is drill baby drill.
well, the secret to finance, the way these mysterious forces work that create trillions of dollars out of thin air and able to project that power based on future promises, that dangerous game is premised on collateral. Bankers can create new money out of thin air if you have the equivalent of something to guarantee it with. That means rich people can borrow all the money they want, pay it back later. Rich people can't borrow any money. Internationally, Britain imposed the gold standard in 1820, and that tried to put a lid on the amount of money governments could create. They're trying to limit their rivals' military spending. And so, if you wanted to be a good member of international society, you had to hold the real gold equivalent of how much finance your economy was operating on, and that put a real physical limit on the amount of money you could create, on the amount of power you could project, and it turns politics into a zero-sum game. If I have all the gold, it won't last long because I have to spend it to other people who will then have it, and it goes back and forth, and that keeps a lid on bankers. And that's why we have periodically financial crises throughout history, and that's when bankers are allowed to run wild, creating new money without the solid collateral. And and so the world has carried on like that often. The gold standard broke down in the lead up to World War II. That allowed Germany to borrow gobsmacking amounts of money from the British and American central banks to rearm and refinance a war because there weren't those sort of controls. They were reimposed after World War II. And so after World War II, there was very tight development, controlled, cooperative, and led to the golden age of capitalism with the strongest growth rates, most egalitarian distribution of the results. And in 1971, that came to an end again. And the reason Nixon ended the international gold standard in 1971 is because of Alberta. Alberta has the world's largest oil field. Since 1888, the bitumen up in Fort McMurray has been recognized, if not America's biggest oil field, the world's. And this is the imperial game. That's the pile of money, 175 billion barrels of oil sitting there that could be used by the bank to print new money. And in 1971, what happened? The reason the US changed the whole international system is because they lost control of Alberta. In 1935, they'd installed a government that gave them control over that oil. Alberta's oil wasn't being developed in the 30s and 40s. And when the federal government tried to develop the oil sands in the 40s, it burned down. Not once, but twice. We just weren't allowed to develop it until the Rockefellers were ready for it later. In 1938, after the Iraq Revolution stripped that oil out of the Western Empire, the US was going to drop a nuclear bomb underground in Fort McMurray to melt the bitumen and in one moment double the world's oil reserves in 1958. Americans just showed up in Alberta and made a press, just announced, we're going to nuke Alberta. They already had the approval of the American government, the Canadian government, the Alberta government, the atomic, everything. They were going to financialize, they were going to prove 175 billion barrels of oil in northern Alberta that was all in their back pocket, given to them for free by the Premier of Alberta they'd installed. But the Prime Minister of Canada stopped them, a nationalist, prevented them from carrying out that plan and got himself replaced in the next federal election. But that is the game that continued until Iraq in 2003, the same day that the U.S. completed the occupation of Iraq and pulled down the statue of Saddam. That was the same day the U.S. Secretary of Energy sent a letter to Alberta notifying us that for the first time, that 175 billion barrels of oil that had been given away free to the Americans was now proven oil. It was now legal collateral. You could take to the bank, print new money, and lend out to whoever you like. And that is the root of predatory subprime mortgage lending in the United States. That is the root of the financial crisis. That's the step change in the world that happened in 2003 when gold and other physical things were the collateral you could use to project financial power. And then there was $9 trillion more after April 9th, 2003, when Iraq was occupied. We didn't have to worry about Saddam flooding the market and tanking prices. Those prices could be held high while we moved millions of barrels of unprofitable Alberta oil. It's incredibly expensive to produce, let alone clean up. But when you're stealing it, you don't mind so much. And within 1 year of Canadian securities regulation being rigged, making that unpaid for, unproduced oil legal collateral, only place in the world you don't have to have any money, any real project, any real production. You get to count those 175 billion barrels as free starting in 2003. And within 1 year, the Federal Bureau of Investigation was publicly warning of a pandemic of predatory mortgage lending.
True.
Using Alberta's oil as the collateral. That's the reason why, for the first time in history, from 2003 to 2007, colored people got mortgages. It's because there was $9 trillion of collateral that enabled this lending. 8 million people lost their homes, but how many lenders went broke, giving out trillions of bad? Zero, because they all still got paid. They simply collected on their collateral, millions of barrels of stolen Alberta oil being produced up here. And it might sound crazy, but it just so happens Canada has a unique banking system where transactions aren't cleared through the central bank. So there's no record kept. So you could transfer $9 trillion across the border and lend it out. There would be no record here that's for some reason. And the only explanation comes back to Ogdensburg, 1940. Canada's not a sovereign state or a colony. And what happens when you're a colony is you're not in charge of important things like the economy or foreign policy or immigration. And that's why politics in Canada are so crazy. They make no sense because we're not in charge of those things. We're in the Americans' back pocket and they're tightening the screws. Trump intends on taking that to the next level. Greenland is not a joke.
But before you move on to that, even though, because that's a whole nother edition, but now it makes so much sense. But I want to ask you a couple of questions because, boy, what an interesting analysis, Reagan. And I've read that in many of your items, and I accept much of it. But let me fill in some of the blanks from where I am from for some of our viewers. to where I can help contextualize and help you help further my understanding of the gobsmacking information that you've just laid down. So going back to the undergirding of the system to be able to finance in the way that you've exemplified, I would say there's more to it than that, just from this perspective, right? So, one, I do throw OPEC in the mix on that for sure. And I've always said from the very beginning, this has been mostly my theory. I'm not a PhD economist. I've just been able to follow the bouncing ball, and I've been able to do enough historical research to understand kind of the nature of the evolution of OPEC, the relationship of the United States with the House of Saud, the amount of the amount of futures based production in that arena of the global sphere based on replacing the gold standard. Now, I'm one of the type of people who see all of the downside of the gold standard as well, because that is the methodology of kings, and it always has been. And I can see the purpose of fiat currency, and I would say that the collateral is also more than oil's, even though oil is a huge, huge, huge part of it, but it's also all sorts of resources, and it's all sorts of capacity, and it's all sorts of research, and it's all sorts of nuclear power and many of the other things that go into the USS superpower carrier that we are, that's just hit the Titanic, right? But what you just laid out for me was incredibly revealing, because somebody must be in Trump's ear, because I guarantee you Trump didn't know all of this stuff, right? I think that Trump is a mastermind of nothing. I think he's surrounded by a bunch of people, of course, out of the Koch empire that would have gone back to what you just laid out, that would be able to kind of put that in those terms that you did, which now leads us to Greenland. But I wonder if you can assess, because going into the 2008 great financial crisis, where this entire world became a smash and grab looting empire for the empire, which is the same as it ever was. Those of us who understand history know that the imperial powers of Western Europe did a lot of the same techniques throughout their rape and pillage of the whole world, quite frankly. And of course, the United States is born to supposedly create a democracy by and for the people with separation of powers, which we can see is not that. And we've seen that it's not that for a very long time. But when you immerse what I've just laid out in your analysis, can you take it a step further? Because I find it a balance of power. Like, it's like when you're the 300-pound bully in the arena, right? That oversees a whole lot of smaller, uh, let's say powers that have incredible resources, but not the ability to withstand your influence because of just your ridiculous, being Godzilla in the room, King Kong in the room, sort of thing, just because of what we've become over all of these years, right? Can you poke any holes in what I just laid out in response to you, and then ultimately take us now back to Greenland? Because to me, if you're looking at the tech bros, for example, right, and you're thinking of, okay, why did Elon suddenly, out of the blue, become the figurehead for the hostile takeover of X, i.e., Twitter, with Jack Dorsey, but he didn't pay to purchase X? He had a cabal of private equity, of the too big to fail operations, of Saudi sovereign wealth fund, and apparently a couple of Russians behind the scene oligarchs, right? Who all represent this sort of thing you're discussing, right? Because they're all involved with financial fuel and fossil fuel, or financialization of fossil fuel, which is securitization, which goes back to collateral. So, based on my contextualization of what I had to say, can you address some of those things and take us through to Greenland?
Well, one of the things to appreciate about what makes gold and oil unique and special when it comes to collateral as opposed to everything else is there's no liability associated with them. Gold is the only collateral asset that has no associated liability. And so it's all profit. It's all on the good side. Everything else, it costs you a certain amount to build that building. It might be worth so much as collateral, but it has costs and liabilities associated with it. And the same is true with every other kind of energy. Anything else you can use as collateral, except when it comes to oil. The oil industry doesn't clean up. Nobody's ever made them clean up. They don't clean up anywhere. And so that oil never used to be collateral until the 70s. It was only in the 70s, piecemeal across U.S. in Chicago, California, Texas, savings and loan stuff where oil reserves were available. That's when they
So
first
true.
started being used. But even that oil, they didn't own. They have to buy it from the landowner, and there's a chance they might be forced by someone to clean it up. That's different here in Alberta in the $9 trillion of oil they stole. They
Interesting.
control the government, they control the law, they're under no risk whatsoever of having to pay for it or clean it up, making that $9 trillion of collateral pure gravy, not just entrepreneurial 10% profit on it,
Yeah.
straight gravy. And then to have that in a second to start flexing all over the world is, and it's, it takes on a life of its own. That's why Alberta is the center of world empire and has been for a century. Here, under the king's rule, where he writes a letter and gives this away to his friend who starts the Hudson Bay Company or whoever comes after him, the owners of all of that oil have a letter from the king in their back pocket.
You're going way back to the Crown of England, right? You're talking about that's the original multinational corporation.
And it's true up until including this day. In British Commonwealth systems, in our parliamentary systems, all over the world, we all have one thing. We have governor generals. We have a representative of the king. And what he's there for, it's not just for ceremonies and pomp. He has a veto on all legislation. You try to do something the king doesn't like, the governor general doesn't sign it, you don't have a law. And 100 years ago, that started to be a worry for imperialists. British democracy was developing. The Labour Party, Parliament, especially after the First World War, there's a threat of democracy there. And so in 1926, the British Empire held an imperial conference, and the Canadian Prime Minister suggested we give that power to veto legislation to the king himself. Not, we don't want to leave that with Parliament. Some democratic Parliament could allow something dangerous. And so ever since 1926, all across the British Empire, Canada, Australia, everywhere else, including today, every state has a governor general, every province has a lieutenant governor general. And if they don't sign your law, you don't have a law. So in 1926, Alberta tried to conserve our oil. They held a conference and gave the king power to not sign that law. And so they have complete control, and they have a veto to prevent us from using it. And that's how they've angled and kept Alberta ready until 2003 when they were ready to pull the trigger. And that's what transformed the financial system.
Well, true, but let me
And
ask you this question too. Well, how would you? Okay, but I do also know, right, Reagan? I'm not pressing back against everything you're saying, and I'm saying it's a huge, huge, huge piece of it. But I will also add that we had $70 trillion of global appetite buying our mortgage-backed securities because we had shifted the middle class pretty much throughout the world, and they were looking for a safe place to park capital. And up until that time, we actually had rules and regulations to where our housing market did not have the volatility, and it was pretty much a sure thing, right? Because nobody would give up their house in the United States before it became a commodity to flip, ultimately based on all the control fraud that we lay out. But $70 trillion is a mammoth investment, but parlay that into because see what you're saying to me, and I'd like to go back, but after you answer this question, it's kind of a compounded question. I apologize, but the nature and the gravity of what you've laid out in 2003 because of its proximity after 9/11, and then ultimately the Iraq War, I could see how Wall Street's got one angle going on, while the Pentagon and the powers that be within the know of Canada's resources could work within the financial system, which would take it back to Rockefeller, in my opinion, because that's the intersection. Can you explore the Rockefeller play here and what it all manifested into and how that works?
well, I think what's confusing to make sense of the dynamics is the difference between the private sector and the public sector. And all of these players, all throughout this history, they span back and forth. The imperialists, the politicians, they're private, they're public, they're in government. It's the revolving door, and they keep and the same. Oh, And so in the 70s, when the gold standard ended and new sources of collateral emerged for private finance, a lot of these same forces got privatized again.
Right.
It wasn't US foreign policy anymore. Things were shifting more to Wall Street. They
Right.
were no just like the British when in the 1930s British was basically selling its empire to America. In the 20s and 30s, America was buying it all up, and their slogan, what they'd said at the time was, unlike the British, we're too smart. We're not going to try to rule the world. We're merely going to own it.
Hmm.
And so after the 70s, it's this new financial capacity. They've just used that to buy things quietly, carefully. Davos and all assorted annual conferences is a way for the private sector to coordinate its efforts, but it straddles the public sector, but it's not controlled. It's no longer controlled by the public sector like it was after the Second World War, where these forces were deeply integrated into the U.S. state to build and solidify. But by the 70s, those same sort of forces, which involved the British and all the sort of international imperial rentier forces, have shaped it in and out of government. And that's where we sort of lose track of. These are the same interests. They may be operating from the government in the 50s, but by the 80s, they're at think tanks and on Wall Street. And as that power grows and accumulates, their power is expressed under the surface. It's the subtext. They are driving the narrative, driving the policy. Politics is stupid. It's of no consequence. It doesn't add up. They don't, nobody even tries to be serious because these things aren't up for debate. There's a show, there's something filling the space, but the interests are constant, and they've been in the state sector and out of it. And I think that helps explain how the private interest captured Alberta. And during the Second World War, it was absorbed into the American state and the Pentagon and that. And after the 70s, the control and interests of that, you won't find it in US foreign policy. It's not reflected in official statements. That's all back to the private sector. Those concerns about Alberta became a democracy in 1971, elected a local patriotic premier who knew the score, started enforcing the law, quadrupled royalties, and until he was forced out, that's what this private the interests were focused on. Wall Street was focused on, and I think that's a big part of the mystery of we look to the state, but that's not where it's happening. And imperialists don't talk. They don't boast. They tell BS. They say something, but they don't. You won't find internal planning documents like the state sector laying out sort of thing. You have to be a scientist. You have to observe them, what they're doing in the real world, and figure it out that way. And I think that's more or less how you figured out most of this, is just staring at this, trying to make sense of it, knowing what the academics and bankers are saying doesn't add up, and
Right.
you just keep trying to make sense of
Pound
it.
and pound and pound it. And but the thing on my end, what it led me to was the full faith and credit of the United States that was backdoored through Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which was the whole smoke and mirrors that was predicated upon what you're talking about, this mega merger, right? But I'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to ask you again, even though what you just described was the answer I was looking for. But am I amiss to say that what you just described was really the Rockefeller influence, right? Because post World War II, because who are Rockefellers? Rockefellers were Standard Oil. Rockefellers were the largest. If we think Elon Musk is huge with his paradigm at the moment, Rockefellers dwarf that infinitum, right? We know that. We know what the interest was after the growth of the fossil fuel industry in the United States, how it manifested through World War II, and then ultimately what you're telling us about Alberta, and then going into, Bretton Woods and all of the things post, getting off the gold standard, which again takes us back to the full faith and credit of the United States, predicated on what you're saying. I mean, because it all makes sense. Because I think a lot of Americans right now are like, Greenland, Canada, like what, So why don't you just, instead of me trying to, why don't you give me like a common moment, like just reflection of what Canada's or Canadians are feeling about Trump's buffoonery, but his proclamations about Greenland and Canada at the moment.
Well, I don't think the average Canadian is able to make any more sense of it than the average American.
Interesting.
But there's an extremely good guide to making sense of this current situation with Trump and Canada and Greenland, and it has to do with Alaska. Uh, Canada was never supposed to be independent. It's from Thomas Jefferson declared North and South America are all to be peopled by this our confederacy. They were always intended to have the whole hemisphere. When the British were going to make Canada independent, the U.S. Congress passed a bill in 1866 about incorporating all the Canadian states,
Oh yeah.
and passed that a year before Canada sort of became independent by the British Empire. And the Americans did not care for that at all. They did not recognize this. They passed resolutions in Congress protesting this independence. And to make their point, they bought the state of Alaska from Russia on the same day that Canada was created. They paid
Interesting.
20 they paid 25 times more than they would have if they hadn't intended on making it on that one specific day to send a specific message to Canada that you're not independent. You're stuck in the sandwich of America, and one day you'll be ours.
Wow.
And so in 1941, when Pearl Harbor happened, the British knew about it. And they sent their top spy to America to warn them about the Japanese plans to attack Pearl Harbor. But Britain's top spy couldn't get a meeting in Washington at the FBI, but he did get a meeting with Herbert Hoover at the Rockefeller Center in New York. And so he told them all about Pearl Harbor and how it was coming. And he was told to get out and don't let the door hit you on the ass.
No kidding.
And they allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. And within a couple of weeks, Western Canada was occupied by 40,000 American troops. Supposedly building the Alaska Highway, the oil sands project in northern Alberta had just burned down. And so all the construction workers who might have rebuilt it went to work on the Alaska Highway. And for a number of years, 40,000 American troops occupied all of Western Canada, integrating us into their economy. And so that's what Alaska meant in 1867 when we almost declared independence. And so today, I would argue that as the US is trying to tighten its grip on allies like Canada, and we have a very pliant, quisling Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has done everything the Americans could have ever asked for, bought their pipelines, it's all, etc. But he's been forced from office, and the Americans' preferred candidate in the next election is hopefully going to replace him. And so, on an important imperial anniversary, the anniversary of Trump's insurrection, January 6th was also the anniversary of the British-American conspiracy to reunite their empires. It was started on January 6th, 1798. And that's the day of the insurrection. And then this last January 6th was the day that, for some reason, the Canadian Prime Minister resigned, leaving the political battlefield wide open to the Americans' preferred replacement. And
Wow.
2 weeks earlier, December 24th, which is the imperial anniversary of the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve Bank was created on February 23rd, 1913. And on the anniversary of that, President-elect Trump appointed his new ambassador to Denmark, announcing that the ownership of Greenland was essential to the security of the U.S. And so in the arc of history, it looks a lot like the U.S. would be willing to pay 25 times too much for Greenland if their candidate doesn't win the next Canadian election. And so I've been arguing for a couple years now that World War III has already been declared by the United States. And I think that's what we're witnessing today with Trump coming in all guns blazing.
Wow, this is so fascinating because I didn't know it would take this turn, and that anniversary sort of dialectic was really intriguing because so when I started off on my journey, okay, I'm just looking at it through the lens of an American who had been brought up through, our educational format, our university structure, what I studied in political science, what I thought was my full knowledge of how things worked out in history. I didn't have as much of a detailed knowledge of Canada, and I'm now going to start diving in a hell of a lot more, but I'm not going to be able to catch up. But I'll tell you, my gut has always been, and this is why I named my first documentary film Forward 13 Waking Up the American Dream, which was the notion of the revolution and then, of course, the embodiment of the Bill of Rights and the separation of powers and everything that would make us nonlinear under the British aristocracy. I mean, that's the entire identity of the United States. But when I looked at what appeared to be the last 40 years, but manifesting in our corporate fascist conundrum, what I continued to see was an aristocracy. Yanis Varoufakis calls it techno-feudalism. It's just when those are above the law and market forces, that's aristocracy. That's 1,000 years of history. That's fucking ruled by the king. And then we saw what happened in the Supreme Court by etch a sketching the 14th Amendment, Section 3, yada, yada, yada. And I kept in the back of my head this whole time, wait a second. Have we just been hijacked by forces centuries in the making? But from what I'm hearing you say, kind of, maybe that's the deal.
Well, brace yourself because I trace this back. This is about the rule of law. That's the root of it. There's a small minority of violent sociopaths who are completely opposed to submitting to the rule of law
Right.
at all. Royalty.
They're above the law.
And the first challenge they ever got was the Magna Carta in 1215. That was the first limits placed on the divine rulers,
right.
And he didn't like it. He had the barons who started excommunicated, but the king died. France had invaded. There was a 9-year-old king. So to get the locals back on side in 1217, they readopted the Magna Carta. On September 11th, 1217, the Magna Carta came into force. For the first time, there was the rule of law, limits placed on kings and queens.
Right.
And they absolutely despised it. And September 11th it's the greatest moment in that's Western civilization. That's the first stumbling steps we took to the rule of law.
Right.
And it was commemorated by 1291. That's when the Scottish won independence. September 11th, 1297, they won independence. During the English Civil War, the first kind of popular politics democratic movement in the Western world, the Levelers was the first Democratic Party. They submitted their large petition calling for popular sovereignty and all sorts of other democratic reforms on September 11th, 1648. Wow. It was a positive anniversary for the public, but was soon used by the elites to turn the tide, turn it back. And starting with the Pope in 1458, issuing a bull re-allowing slavery. From there, the tide of history starts turning. The elites start their efforts to subvert, get around this rule of law, get around having to pay your debts. Royalty also really hates doing that. And their plan has always been escaping Europe, where they have civil law and peer competition to colonies. And the bounty of the Western world, America and Canada, that's the British royalties' escape hatch. And this little pile of money is what they've been building a world system around their control. And that pile of money in Alberta is now what's in the Americans' hands and being flexed about because they have those trillions of dollars outside of the rule of law and outside of market forces.
That connects the latest September 11th, because I think there's a bit of an intriguing composite there as well, in a perverse way, as it always is, because that's what absolute power does, is it corrupts absolutely. And when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it and a moral code to glorify it. We've known that since the 17th century, right? But September 11th, 2001, we knew where the terrorist cells were. We knew who was funding them. We had, I don't remember what the budget was for national intelligence at that time, but I can promise you that we had enough resources to take out 19 hijackers very easily that wound up hijacking those airliners and then manifesting what would ultimately become what would lead to Iraq, right? And all of the rest of it. So in a perverse way, that September 11th anniversary almost seems to mirror what you're espousing because, if you're Dick Cheney, if you're the Bush administration, if you're the neocons, and you're kind of in that sort of hegemony of what you just described, well, by all means, you need a spectacular event to justify the outcome, which I've always held. I've always held that, Saudi didn't create 9/11, but Saudi manifested it and played its role based on this juggernaut of what you're talking about. And I've always questioned in the back of my mind, okay, who does the CIA work for and why? But I always continue to contextualize it back to fossil fuel. Now, you're up in Alberta. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. I'm in our, stranglehold of the corporate military, industrial, financial, fossil fuel complex in Houston, Texas, right? Which, of course, those pipelines come straight down from Alberta through the tar sands and all the way through, the heartland of our country into the refineries down in Bowtown and all the rest of it, right? That is the hive of power that manifested ultimately out of the Exxon / Standard Oil empire, i.e., Rockefellers, that then comes back to the full faith and credit of the United States. This is an amazing journey when you really consider it. It's kind of like what I always say, David Byrne, the prophet of the talking heads, would say, same as it ever was, right? It never changes. It's all the same thing. It's just the deception and the house of tricks and all of the shadow sector. So from where you're sitting in Canada, looking down the barrel of this bloviating orange turd that basically has now got absolute power as a freaking aristocrat because the Supreme Court gave it to him. And he's obviously not smart enough to execute it himself, but he's got everybody in that side of the fence from the Koch brothers forward who've been playing this game for a long time. What is your resistance? What would you say to your friends in the United States that are all against Trump and everything that's happening right now that has turned our democracy upside down, inside out? Not yesterday, not on November 5th, 2025 or 2024, but literally decades and decades and decades ago. He's just the ultimate incarnation, manifestation, reflection of what we're talking about. What do you think we should pursue in like-minded ventures between allies of democracy?
Well, I think there's very common themes in both the American domestic situation and foreign, and what we're missing, what the colonies have always lacked, is the rule of law. And at home in America, you've had a taste of that. And here in Alberta from 1971 to 85, we got a little taste of that too. We had real representative government. We had the rule of law. We were in charge of our resources, took a bigger chunk. But like in 1935, when they installed a premier, they held a special session of the legislature to literally in black letter law make the oil industry above the law in Canada. Couldn't be appealed to any court. They're just simply that 17th century philosopher. That's a concrete example of that manifestation of committing a crime is one thing, but the ultimate objective is to entrench it in law like
Right.
they did. And that's what makes this difference.
To loot the national purse and the resources.
Which is an age-old game that we understand well, but there is one very critical difference, and that's what makes today's situation so urgent. When kings and queens spent gold, it didn't ruin the planet. When today's oligarchs spend their oil, we warm the climate and we're soon going to cook. And so this isn't a story of yet another piece of imperialism and a few million unfortunate Albertans under one of the many boots. Alberta has enough carbon to fry the world. There will be no livable future.
Right, and I remember seeing that. I remember seeing that when I was looking at all of the things that led to oh boy, what were the protests and on the tar sands pipeline during Obama, right? And all of those things I meant because once the tar sands are unleashed, not to mention the methane that could happen with some of the global warming that happens up in your tundra and everything else. I mean, once that happens, it's game over, right? I mean, that's literally within a decade, the whole world is toast, right? And so, but a key to unlocking that step, even though it's already happened, is the tar sands. So we're literally talking about roulette right now, right? I mean, it's not something that we haven't known for a very long time. But again, I'll reiterate the question to you: what can we do together? You're talking about the law, right? Those who understand science, those who understand geopolitics, those who understand human rights, those who understand allies, and a rising tide raises all ships. Can you give me sort of a paradigm initiative that from your neck of the woods we can domino on our side of the fence?
Well, what we need here is reinstating the rule of law. Our courts don't work. My friends and I have spent the last couple of decades trying to use the court, trying to use the law. But what we've eventually uncovered is that we're a colony. And so those laws do not work. And when it comes to critical issues like this, they will not work. And even if we elected a government and passed a law, the king wouldn't sign it and it wouldn't happen. Americans, yourself, are now under siege. The the class war is being brought home. He's waging war on his allies and the
It's just our
domestic.
courts to do it, my friend.
But you guys still have the courts. There is still,
By a thread.
I know, that's all I thought we had, and making trying to pursue that, but it's not even available here. We're left in the same sort of situation as First Nations, who don't have recourse within the law or are forced to go to the United Nations and treaty mechanisms, different sorts of ways to, because we can't inside the same system. And
Right.
that's where Americans themselves are slipping, that the
Absolutely.
system hasn't served them for a long time. Any morsels that still do won't be around for long, but those are the biggest things we have to grasp on. But I think what it comes down to is simply recognizing, and it's all you talk about for good reason, the criminal nature of the
Yes.
system, because that at the heart of it, that's that's the best answer. It isn't because it's too complicated or we're too stupid. They're criminals. It isn't that there's no money and we can't, is that they have all of it. And if you stop the criminals, and here in Canada, and we're also a colony, so we shouldn't have any illusions about what we could do. But if we declared independence, I'd be perfectly fine saying, "Thanks, Americans, you got us good. Keep everything you took." That's like there's no hope of any sort of, but just from now on, everything left coming out of the ground tomorrow on is going to be for us, and we're going to just prioritize that and decide. And if that happened, Alberta and Canada could solve all of our problems, clean up the mess we've been saddled with, take care of all the people that have been hurt, and make the transition to a sustainable future. That's how much money is coming out of the ground. Hundreds of billions of dollars in Alberta. There's only a few million people. But with the rule of law and democracy, then not only could we cripple the financial machine that is poisoning everything, a zero sum game, everything we take from them increases us, diminishes them. That's ultimately what we need. Democracy and rule of law, capturing this free money that comes out of the ground. That's what it comes down to. They never paid for this oil. And so it's free money coming out of the ground. And economists for a century have known you can't just let that go to private people. That would be a grave injustice. It's nature's surplus. That's actually what runs the world. That surplus of what comes out of the ground is the driving force. It needs to be under popular control. On some countries like Russia or China or other third world countries that have revolution, it's to take control of those resources, to have that free money to direct. And if Alberta had that, there'd be a chance that a livable future, we'd have a chance at avoiding climate change. If Alberta isn't independent, there's no hope for any of us. The Americans have full control of enough carbon. There's nothing standing in the way of them burning all of it as quickly as they can. And if you're looking for a small group of people who might not care about the rest of civilization, the first place to check would be the royalty, the monarchs, the oligarchs, those advocates of nuclear war. Those are the people who've never been afraid to risk everybody else. And that's what it comes down to, is this is what's underlying world politics and economics, is this quiet control of all this money. But when they spend it, carbon comes. And
Right. So Reagan,
if
Reagan, you nail. So first of all, thank you for that, because it's interesting that you qualified that. Yeah, what I've been driving with tremendous tenacity and capacity, and just almost like I'm obsessed, which I am, is that it is all about the criminals. It's not rocket science, it's racketeering. And what I do is I make a lot of people who don't know what we know, for example, right? And you've just enlightened me in a lot of stuff that I didn't know, by the way, which I always appreciate. And I learn so much more every day. But, um, they bristle when I say I'm the guy who's got the answers, because they think I'm trying to put myself and juxtapose myself above everybody else. No, it's because everybody who's in the system won't reveal, everybody who knows how it works is working for the corruption. I'm the one who actually did the work that went to the distance to get this information that leads to what you're actually saying, which is I have the tangible evidence. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't theory. This is just straight up bulletproof, ironclad evidence that $71 trillion has been looted from the Treasury or the Federal Reserve of the United States vis-a-vis the Treasury in some capacities when we get into 2019 based on repo stuff and Steve Mnuchin post Dodd-Frank. And yes, I do know what I'm talking about, people. That $71 trillion that spanned 3 presidencies that went up to Biden rescuing, Silicon Valley Bank, which is a direct corollary to Peter Thiel and the tech bros, for example, that these guys have literally, we've given tens of trillions of dollars over the course of 14 years illegally to put the billionaires and the billionaire apparatuses above market forces and above the law, which means you don't have capitalism and you don't have the law, which means you don't have the United States of America or democracies around the world, which then has led to this perverted inversion, which is tyranny, which is aristocracy, what I call corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses the full faith and credit of the United States that relies on Alberta to fuel the mafiocracy that's now creating fascism, all of which are the absolute inverse perverse of everything that I've ever learned or stood for or thought was important in this world, not to mention the sustainability of what the possibilities are, especially because we have the technology to do it with cooperation as well. So, for example, and to finish this thought out and to give you the final word, it is the pathway to redemption. It is the only pathway to sustainability. And so, am I the savior? No, I'm not. The truth of what we're talking about is the savior. It's the story, it's the revelation, it's the relationship that then leads us to hopefully galvanizing behind what we call, no pun intended, the clean New Deal. Because the question is there a better way to spend $71 trillion than on people that are destroying everything that matters, including our ability to survive? So $71 trillion, and I'll finish off with this. Like, if I were able to genesis a movement, right, where it's a new civil rights-like movement where we create the revolution, the Bernie revolution that he never got to because he never really tackled fraud the way it should be, but ultimately where people understood this based on the precepts of the Clean New Deal that we put out, and we get to a point where it's like, Jesus Christ, people, our friends up north, the Canadians, based on what I've just heard from my friend here, Reagan, not only deserve just an exorbitant amount of interest from the United States in recreation, especially because when I think about this, Reagan, right, we have massive hydrothermal capacity in Canada. We have great hydrogen out of Canada and Greenland. Actually, Greenland, there are alternatives from the north that could power the entire freaking world with a new paradigm that I bet we could deliver for monumentally less than $71 trillion that we can demonstrate has already been looted to what now mainstream in the United States, including the likes of Rachel Maddow, or like, oh my God, Biden said the quiet part out loud that we're an oligarchy. And where was she on Elon 6 months ago? You know what I mean? It's just like, so you've heard what I say in my truth bombs all the time. I'm going to give you the final word here to kind of encapsulate what I just said from a Canadian perspective.
Well, I think following your work and what I've uncovered and the similar frustration, it becomes pretty clear that there's a bright dividing line between society and the jungle, the uncivilized, the elites, the monarchy, and that dividing line is good faith. Normal people operate in good faith. They pursue their own interest, but honestly, in competition with others. And in many societies around the world, the law is civil society. Civil law obligates citizens to carry out their affairs in good faith. Otherwise, nothing can work.
That's
All
right.
society is built on cooperation. Without that minimal, and that's what Trump and the assorted, the sand in the gears, they'll bring that to a halt. And that good faith, that's what we need to demand of ourselves and everyone who's involved in the public debate and every politician. That's what reveals these crooks,
That's
is
right.
their bad faith. You push them into a corner, you push them next to the secrets they're not allowed to talk about. They're bad. They can't operate in good faith because their interests are in complete contrast to democracy and the rule of law, so they have to be dishonest. That's how we recognize them, and it's unacceptable. Anyone behaving in the public sphere in bad faith should be shunned. Not not you get to do it again tomorrow and the next day and the next day over and over. That should disqualify you from public service, and the same for politicians and interests. That insisting on good faith, integrity, carrying out your affairs, that's how we could build a society and a movement that would could turn things around and impose the rule of law again, because it's not a matter of self-respect, it's survival when it comes to these issues these days. And so the rule of law, and if we could have that good faith reflected in the regulation of the financial sector, that's how Americans more than anyone else know how to do the financial regulation, policing. Bill Black, and in the 80s, it was done. It can be done. It could be done again.
Which is
And
exactly what I'm reflecting, right? Because when people hear me for the first time and they don't know my work, they think I'm talking about me. No, I don't live in a vacuum. I'm a conduit to these people that you just referenced. And what I've known my entire life is that systems cannot work without integrity. But you can't. But I also learned on my journey, and I'll go back to a point that you made earlier. This was kind of my declaration, well, it was my declaration when I first made my first documentary film, Forward 13, Waking Up the American Dream, where I said, I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. And the fact is, until you believe that, and you're not a slave who accepts criminality to completely control you, then you cannot be a citizen, particularly in a free democracy. And that's why you can't hold power to account. So when you talked about the the rule of law, that we've done it before, that we have to do it again. And of course, that was the revolution of the United States, severed ties with King George III to manifest separation of powers and the law, which isn't the first time in history this happened. I think it goes back to Hammurabi and the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, we're talking thousands of this thing's been going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth the entirety of human history, right? And so we're now find ourselves in a juggernaut once again, but with everything on the line and everything that we've learned for literally thousands of years just hyperinflated because of technology, right? And because of the intersectionality of our everything that fuels the society as it is. And so what I'll say to our viewers is I say thank you to you, Reagan, for this, I think, a very enlightening and invigorating conversation about the alliance and the solidarity that people from two different countries can obviously see. And if we can see it, then other people can certainly see it as well, right? I continue to use the children's nursery rhymes of the metaphors that you got to be able to see the forest for the trees, and that Trump is the emperor's new clothes. And then I digress to my younger years on really bad acid. He's a freaking nightmare. He's not. He's just so incapable of anything that's happening. It's the system that's behind him that we are illustrating to you that has pulled a complete diabolical betrayal, and they're going to shove this shit sandwich in your face like waterboarding the country until you choke or until you get off your ass and join an enlightened movement where you become a nuclear reaction vector to truth. Because when you live in light, you live in truth. When you live a lie, you are depraved. When you have the truth, you are bulletproof. When you lie inside, you die. So, my friend, liberty, truth, and justice is what I stand for. And I know that we can find a way together to hopefully try to shed light on a very dark time period in both of our existence.
Thanks, Patrick.
All the best. Adios, my man. Take care.
Take care.